At my brother's wedding, my family introduced me to guests as the one who didn't amount to much all night. My brother shrugged. I gave a speech instead of a toast. Before the cake was cut, the whole table knew the truth. When my father put his arm around a man I'd never met and said, "And this is my other son, the one we don't brag about." I was holding a glass of champagne that cost more than my first monthly paycheck, standing in a ballroom my family had rented for $28,000, wearing a suit I'd bought with money they didn't know I had. I smiled, not the tight, defensive smile of someone absorbing an insult. The specific, controlled smile of someone who has been waiting a very long time for exactly this moment and knows, with absolute precision, how the next 4 hours are going to go. The man my father had introduced me to was a city councilman named Douglas Abner, and he had the practiced warmth of a politician, the handshake already extended, his face already arranging itself into polite interest. My father was still talking. Devlin here took the scenic route in life, couldn't quite figure out what he wanted to do, but we love him anyway. Douglas Abner smiled at me the way people smile at someone they've just been told is a disappointment, that particular cocktail of pity and relief that it isn't them. I shook his hand. I said it was lovely to meet him, and then I excused myself to find another glass of champagne and a quiet corner where I could check my phone, confirm that the email I'd been waiting for had arrived, and let the evening proceed exactly as I'd planned it. My name is Devlin Okafor, and I'm going to tell you everything, not just about the wedding, but about the 18 years that made the wedding necessary. I'm 36 years old. My brother Rowan is 32, and he got married on a Saturday in September at the Whitmore Grand Hotel in Columbus, Ohio, to a woman named Petra Halverson, who is perfectly pleasant and entirely blameless in everything that follows. Rowan is an orthodontist with a practice in Dublin, Ohio, and a house with a 3-car garage, and he is my parents' success story, the son they describe in Christmas cards and at dinner parties, and apparently at his own wedding reception when introducing me to city councilmen. My parents are Gerald and Nora Okafor. My father came to the United States from Nigeria in 1981 with an engineering degree and a specific or unambiguous vision of what success looked like and what it required of the people in his family. My mother is originally from Columbus, a white woman from a Catholic family who met my father at Ohio State and who has spent 40 years being warm and loving and, in every moment that mattered, silent. I want to be precise about that. My mother was not cruel. She was absent in the particular way of people who love you, but love peace more, who choose not to see things, because seeing them would require a response. I spent most of my childhood oscillating between hoping she'd say something and accepting that she wouldn't. Rowan was always the golden child in a way that I don't entirely blame him for, because children don't choose the roles their families assign them, and some people simply settle into theirs with more comfort than others. And for he was the good student, the organized one, the one who called home weekly and brought his girlfriend to every family function and chose a career my father could explain at parties. I was the one who read too much, argued too often, changed my major twice, and spent 3 years after college doing work that my parents described as unclear when relatives asked about it. What I was actually doing during those 3 years was building a software company with 2 friends from college, a data infrastructure firm called Arca Systems, in a rented office in Cleveland with secondhand furniture and a shared belief that we'd identified a gap in enterprise data management that nobody else had figured out how to fill correctly. We were right. By year 3, we had 11 clients. By year 5, we had 62 and had raised $4.1 million in Series A funding. I had told my parents about the company multiple times, in detail. My father had listened with the specific quality of attention he gave to things he didn't consider worth his full attention, asked once whether I had benefits and a retirement plan, and then moved the conversation to Rowan's expanding practice. That was in 2019. I stopped trying to explain Arca to my parents shortly after that, not out of bitterness, but out of efficiency. Some information doesn't find its audience, no matter how many times you transmit it. The first time I was introduced as the one who didn't amount to much, it wasn't at the wedding. I want to be clear about that. It was at a family dinner in April, 4 months before the wedding, a Sunday night at my parents' house in Upper Arlington. At 11 people around the dining room table, my Aunt Felicity visiting from Atlanta with her husband Clive and their 2 adult daughters. My father had been talking about Rowan's new practice expansion, the second location, the additional staff, the waiting list that now stretched to 8 weeks. Aunt Felicity had asked about me, which I appreciated, and my father had said, with the light dismissive tone of a man who considers the subject closed, Devlin is still finding his way. I was 35 years old. I'd been running a company with 28 employees for 6 years, finding my way. I'd let it go that night, the way I'd let it go dozens of times before, because the cost of correcting it felt higher than the cost of absorbing it. My therapist, Dr. Yewande Asante, who has a PhD in clinical psychology and has been working with me for 4 years on the specific damage that conditional family approval inflicts on the architecture of adult self-concept, has a name for this pattern of avoidance. She calls it strategic minimization. The idea that if you make yourself small enough, the conflict disappears. I'd been practicing strategic minimization for approximately 18 years, and I can tell you from extensive personal experience that it doesn't work. The conflict doesn't disappear. It just accumulates interest. The dinner in April was the night I started making plans for the wedding. I didn't tell anyone I was making plans. Not Dr. Asante, not my business partner Kwame Boateng, not my girlfriend Soren Lindqvist, LB, who had been in my life for 2 years, and who is the kind of person who says what she thinks without cruelty, and who had told me after the April dinner in the car on the way home that she thought my family's treatment of me was one of the stranger things she'd encountered in a life that had included several genuinely strange things. I didn't tell Soren because I knew she'd want to help, and I didn't want help. I wanted to do this one thing alone, from start to finish, with no assistance and no witnesses until the moment I chose to have witnesses. What I did over the next 4 months was document. I kept a running file on my laptop, a simple document in which I recorded every instance, every comment, every introduction, every casual dismissal. The April dinner entry ran to 6 paragraphs. The family barbecue in June, one where my father told his brother that I was between things, added 4 more. A phone call in July in which my mother mentioned that Rowan had invited me to be in the wedding party, and that she hoped I'd behave appropriately, which was doing a lot of work as a phrase, contributed 2 pages because I asked her what she meant, and the conversation that followed was instructive in ways I needed to document carefully. I also did something else. 3 weeks after the April dinner, I called Kwame and told him it was time to move forward with the acquisition conversation we'd been having in the background for 8 months. Kwame is my co-founder and equal partner at Arca, a systems architect by training, who is also the most methodical person I've ever worked with. Alex, the kind of person who treats every decision like a structural engineering problem and is almost always right. He said he'd been thinking the same thing. We'd been approached by a larger data infrastructure company called Viridian Technologies in late 2022 about a potential acquisition. The conversations had stalled twice over valuation disagreements, but the fundamental interest was real and the market timing was increasingly favorable. I told Kwame I wanted to close before the end of September. He asked if there was a specific reason for that timeline. I told him I had a wedding to attend in September, and I wanted to attend it with the paperwork signed. He was quiet for a moment and then said, "Okay, Dev, let's close it." We retained an M&A attorney named Priscilla Fontaine, who had 20 years of experience in technology acquisitions and the reputation of someone who treats a negotiation like a problem to be solved with maximum precision and minimum sentimentality. Priscilla had closed 14 technology deals above $50 million in her career, and she came recommended by 3 separate people I trusted. She reviewed our existing term sheet with Viridian, identified 4 points of significant undervaluation, and told us in our first meeting that she thought we'd left considerable money on the table in the previous negotiations, and she intended to put it back. I told her to proceed. The negotiation ran from late April through the end of July, which is faster than these things typically move, and which Priscilla later told me was a function of both sides being genuinely motivated and her being unwilling to let momentum die between sessions. The final agreed acquisition price was $31.4 million, split between Kwame and me according to our equity arrangement, with an earn-out provision tied to a 2-year performance period that could add another $6 million at the high end. My net share of the base acquisition was $17.8 million before taxes and fees. Priscilla emailed me the final executed agreement on August 3rd at 2:17 in the afternoon. I was sitting in my car in the parking lot of a Whole Foods in Cleveland because I'd needed to be somewhere alone when it came through, and home felt too contained for what I anticipated feeling. I read the email 3 times, and then I sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes watching people load groceries into their cars and thinking about my father saying finding his way at a dinner table in April and what it would mean to say nothing about this for another 6 weeks until my brother's wedding. It would mean having a secret. I was good at secrets. I'd been keeping the secret of who I actually was for most of my adult life. What was 6 more weeks? I drove home and made dinner and didn't tell anyone what had just happened, including Soren, which I want to acknowledge was not my finest moment as a partner, and which I told her about 3 days after the wedding with a full explanation of why I'd done it. And which she forgave me for, in the complicated way that people who love you forgive you for things that they partially understand and partially just accept because they've decided you're worth the occasional inexplicable decision. I texted Rowan to confirm I'd be at the rehearsal dinner. He texted back a thumbs up emoji, which was about the level of fraternal warmth our relationship had settled into. We hadn't had a real conversation since Christmas. I wasn't angry at Rowan the way I was at my parents. I was more specifically disappointed in the particular way you're disappointed in a sibling who saw the same things you saw and made a different choice about what to do with them, which is its own specific loneliness. The rehearsal dinner was at a restaurant called Marchetti's in the short north on the Friday night before the wedding. It was a private room with 40 guests, white tablecloths, the kind of place where the menu doesn't list prices. I arrived at 7 p.m. in a charcoal gray suit, alone because Soren was in Stockholm for work and wasn't arriving until the following morning. My mother hugged me at the door with genuine warmth, which I want to say clearly because she is not the villain of this story in the way my father is, and the distinction matters to me. My father shook my hand with the particular quality of attention that communicates you are present without being important. Rowan was across the room with Petra and her family, her parents Lars and Ingrid Halverson from Minneapolis, her brother Felix, 2 aunts, and he waved from across the room when he saw me, which was the full extent of our greeting. I found my seat, which was at the far end of the table from the immediate family cluster, next to my father's colleague, Bernard Achebe, and his wife, a positioning that I'd stopped interpreting charitably years ago. Dinner proceeded with the specific dynamics of a family gathering where the surface is pleasant and the subtext is structural. My father made a toast to Rowan and Petra that lasted 6 minutes and covered Rowan's academic achievements, his professional accomplishments, his character, his future. I timed it. He mentioned me twice. Once when listing the people in the room he was grateful for, in a list that also included family friends we've known for years, and once when he said, even Devlin made the trip from Cleveland, as though I'd traveled in from Siberia rather than from 2 hours away to attend my brother's wedding rehearsal dinner. But even Devlin made the trip. I ate my risotto. I did not say anything. I was saving it. The wedding day was September 14th, a Saturday. The ceremony was at St. Michael's Church at 1 p.m., and the reception was at the Whitmore Grand Hotel starting at 6. Soren arrived at my hotel room at 9 a.m., looking like someone who had managed a transatlantic flight with characteristic composure, wearing dark jeans and carrying 2 cups of coffee, and she looked at my face when I opened the door and said, "Tonight's the night, isn't it?" It wasn't a question. I told her yes. She handed me one of the coffees and came inside and sat on the edge of the bed and asked me to tell her the plan. I told her the plan. She listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I love most about her. And when I finished, she was quiet for a moment and then said, "I have one question. Are you doing this for you, or are you doing this to hurt them?" I thought about it. I said I thought I was doing it for me, and that it would probably also hurt them, and that I'd made my peace with the overlap. She nodded. She said, "Okay, I'm going to be in that room, and I'm going to watch, and if it looks like you're okay, I'll let you do it. And if it looks like it's going wrong in a way you haven't planned for, I'm going to come stand next to you." I said I didn't need a safety net. She said she knew and was providing one anyway. This is what love looks like when it's done correctly. For the record, the ceremony was beautiful in the way that church ceremonies are beautiful. High ceilings, afternoon light through stained glass. Petra genuinely radiant in a way that made even my managed emotional state produce something warm. Rowan cried during his vows, which surprised me because I hadn't seen my brother cry since we were children, and I didn't know he still had access to that particular register. My mother cried. My father sat very straight and looked proud. I sat in the third row and held the order of service and thought about the email from Priscilla Fontaine and what it contained and what I was going to do with it in approximately 6 hours. The reception was everything my father's taste and my mother's planning could produce, which is to say it was elegant and slightly stiff and very expensive. The Whitmore Grand's Meridian Ballroom held 210 guests in rounds of 10, with a head table for the wedding party, a band called The Current playing a set that leaned toward jazz standards for dinner and would presumably shift to something more danceable later. Soren and I were seated at table 14, which I'd noted was as far from the immediate family tables as geometry permitted. Our table mates were 2 of Petra's college friends and their partners, all of whom were perfectly pleasant and knew nothing about my family dynamics, which made table 14 the most relaxed location in the room. Cocktail hour was where it started in earnest. I had positioned myself near the bar at 6:15, a glass of sparkling water in my hand because I wasn't drinking tonight, and I watched my father work the room. He was good at rooms, I'll give him that. Gerald Okafor had a warmth in social settings that he rationed differently with different people. And at his son's wedding reception, he was operating at full capacity. The handshake, the leaning in, the laugh that was slightly too loud to be accidental. I watched him move from the city councilman, Douglas Abner. That was the introduction I'd overheard at the start of this story, to a table of Petra's extended family, to a cluster of Rowan's colleagues from the dental and orthodontics community. At each stop, within earshot when I could manage it and reported back by Soren at the stops where I couldn't, he told a version of the same family story. Rowan, the successful orthodontist, Petra, the accomplished landscape architect, the family assembled in celebration of everything they'd built. And me, when I came up at all. Devlin, the other one, still figuring things out. We love him, of course. Every family has one. Every family has one. Albert, I heard that specific phrase twice, and I want to be precise about what it does to the body to hear a parent say it about you at your brother's wedding. There's no dramatic physical response. It's more like a room temperature dropping 3 degrees. Imperceptible until you've been in it long enough to notice you're cold. Soren found me at 7:22 p.m. near the back of the ballroom with a look on her face that meant she'd heard something, and it was worse than expected. She told me quietly that she'd been standing near my parents when they were introduced to Lars and Ingrid Halvorsen, Petra's parents, that my father had gone through the family introduction, and when Lars had asked about me, he'd apparently seen us briefly at the ceremony and asked which son was the older one. My father had said, "That's Devlin. What, the one we don't talk about at career day?" He'd said it with a laugh. Lars had laughed politely. Ingrid had looked uncertain. Soren had turned away before she said something she couldn't take back. I held my sparkling water. I looked at my father across the room, who was laughing at something Bernard Achebe had said. And I thought, okay, we're doing this now, not in an hour. Now. I texted my contact. The reply came back in 40 seconds. I went to find the wedding's MC. The MC was a man named Garrett Foley, a professional events host who'd been hired by Rowan and Petra and who had the sleek, unflappable quality of someone who had managed hundreds of receptions and had a contingency plan for every category of unexpected event. I found him near the sound equipment at 7:31 p.m. And I introduced myself as the groom's brother and told him I'd like to give a speech after the best man's toast. He looked at me with a practiced, neutral expression and said that the program was set and there wasn't typically room for additional speakers. And I said I understood and that I'd keep it brief and that it was important. He asked if the couple knew about the speech. I told him that Rowan and I had an understanding about the evening, which was a careful construction that was almost true. Rowan knew I had been planning something because I'd called him 3 weeks before the wedding and told him there were things I needed to say at the reception, and he'd said, "Do what you need to do, Dev," in the specific tone of someone who expects the evening to be mildly awkward and is pre-consenting to it. Like what he didn't know was the specific content of what I was planning to say. Garrett Foley looked at me for another moment, then said he'd allow 3 minutes between the best man's toast and the first course removal. And if I went over 3 minutes, he'd cut the microphone. I said 3 minutes was all I needed. He did not look entirely convinced that this was true, but he wrote something on his clipboard and moved on. The best man was a man named Cillian Park, Rowan's college roommate, and genuinely one of the funniest human beings I've encountered, who gave a 6-minute speech that made the room laugh 4 times and produced a standing ovation. It was a genuinely excellent wedding speech, and I appreciated it even through the specific focused tension I was carrying. When Cillian sat down, Garrett Foley took the microphone briefly and said that Rowan's brother Devlin had a few words for the couple, and the room produced the mild, polite applause of people who are pleasantly surprised by an addition to the program. I took the microphone. I looked at Rowan at the head table. He looked back at me with an expression that was wary and open simultaneously. I looked at my father, who was smiling the automatic smile of someone performing family warmth for an audience. I looked at my mother, who had her hands folded in her lap, and who I noticed had a small crease of something near her eyes that I recognized as worry. I took a breath. I did not look at my notes. I had rehearsed this enough that I didn't need them. I said, "I'll keep this short because I know we're all looking forward to the first course. I want to say something to Rowan and Petra, and then I want to say something to the room, and then I'll sit down and everyone can pretend this was a normal wedding speech. Deal?" Mild laughter. Good. I looked at Rowan. "Rowan, I'm proud of you. Not because of the practice or the house or the waiting list, though those things are real. I'm proud of you because you cried during your vows today, and I didn't expect that from you. And it told me something about you that I'd forgotten, which is that you have access to your heart when it matters. Take care of Petra and take care of yourself. Those are the only 2 things that matter." Rowan was already looking uncertain. Petra was looking at me with an expression I couldn't fully read. I looked back at the room. A lot of you met me tonight for the first time. And a few of you received a particular introduction. Something along the lines of, "This is Devlin, the one who didn't quite figure it out, or the one we don't brag about, or the other one." I know this because I've been here for 3 hours, and I have excellent hearing, and some of you have the kind of faces that tell me exactly what you were just told. And I want to address it directly, because the alternative is letting it stand. And I've been letting things stand for 18 years and I'm 36 and I'm done with it. The room had shifted. The ambient murmur of 200 people managing food and drink and conversation had dropped significantly, and I was aware of it as a physical change, a drop in pressure. My father's smile had gone from automatic to fixed. I continued. "For the last 6 years, and I have been running a company called Arca Systems, a data infrastructure firm based in Cleveland. 28 employees, 62 active enterprise clients, 4.1 million in Series A funding as of 2021. I paused, just briefly. 3 weeks ago, on August 3rd, Arca Systems was acquired by Viridian Technologies for $31.4 million. I heard the room, or rather, I heard the room not being a room for a moment. The specific silence that falls when a social situation recalibrates itself around new information, when the story everyone was operating inside of suddenly has different architecture than they thought. My share of the acquisition was $17.8 million. I mention this not because money is a measure of a person, because it isn't. I mention it because for the past 4 months, my father has been telling people at family events that I'm still finding my way, and I thought it was time to provide an update. I looked at my father directly. His face was doing something I had never seen it do before, which was nothing, completely nothing. Gerald Okafor's face is almost always doing something, projecting authority, performing warmth, communicating subtle hierarchies. Right now, it was doing none of those things. It was a face waiting to know what happened next. I looked back at the room. I don't need anyone's admiration or their reassessment. I'm telling you this because there's a woman at table 14 who has spent 2 years watching my family treat me as a footnote to my brother's story, and she deserves to know, in public, in front of everyone, that I didn't come here tonight to apologize for who I am. I came here to celebrate my brother's wedding. Those 2 things are not in conflict. I looked at Soren. She was looking at me with an expression that I can only describe as completely clear. No performance in it, no social filter, just a person looking at another person and deciding. I looked back at the room one final time. To Rowan and Petra, May you build something together that means more than any numbers anyone can put on it. And may you always know the difference." I handed the microphone back to Garrett Foley and walked back to table 14. The room took about 4 seconds to begin applauding, which in social time is an eternity. But when it came, it was uneven and confused in the way that applause is when people aren't sure what they just witnessed, but feel compelled to respond to it. Soren stood up when I reached the table and hugged me without saying anything, which was exactly right. Cillian Park caught my eye from across the room and gave me a nod that contained a full paragraph of communication. Lars Halverson, seated 2 tables away, was leaning toward Ingrid and saying something low and intent. The reactions at the head table were the ones I watched most carefully. Petra had her hand over her mouth. Rowan was looking at the table in front of him, his jaw working slightly, processing. My mother had her hand pressed flat to her sternum in a gesture I recognized from childhood as the one she made when something had moved her too fast for her to manage the response. And my father was sitting very straight, his champagne glass exactly where it had been when I started speaking, untouched, his face still in that configuration I'd never seen before. The fixed point of a man recalculating something large in real time. Garrett Foley moved to the microphone at 8:04 p.m. and announced the first course with the smooth professional pivot of a man earning his fee, and the room allowed itself to be redirected with the relief of people who wanted a new scene. I sat down and accepted the glass of sparkling water that one of Petra's friends had quietly slid in front of me and spent approximately 5 minutes just breathing. Soren's hand was on my arm. She didn't say anything until I looked at her, and when I looked at her, she said, "How do you feel?" I said, "Like I put something down that I've been carrying for a very long time." She said, "Good." At 8:19 p.m., my phone buzzed with a text from Rowan. It said, "We need to talk. Not tonight, but we need to talk." I replied, "I know. Whenever you're ready." He sent back a single emoji, not the thumbs up this time, the one with the 2 hands pressed together. I didn't know exactly what he meant by it, but I thought it might have been the beginning of something, and I decided to let it be that. At 8:31 p.m., my mother appeared at table 14. She was carrying her champagne glass, and she stood at the edge of our table with the specific posture of a woman who has spent 40 years choosing not to say things and is making a different choice. She looked at me for a moment, and then she said, "I didn't know about the company." I said, "I know." She said, "I should have asked." I said, "Yes." She set her champagne glass down and put her hand on my shoulder briefly, just a moment, then picked up her glass and walked back toward the family tables. It wasn't an apology. It was the beginning of one, which is all a beginning can be. My father didn't come to table 14. I hadn't expected him to, not that night. Gerald Okafor would need time to reconstruct the narrative he'd been operating inside of, and the reconstruction would be slow and imperfect and might never fully happen. And I had made my peace with this. I wasn't looking for my father's conversion. I was looking for my own. At 9:47 p.m., Douglas Abner, the city councilman, found me near the bar during the dancing portion of the evening. He was on his second gin and tonic and had the slightly loosened quality of a politician outside official hours. He said, "Your father introduced us at cocktail hour." I said I remembered. He said, "I want to apologize for how he characterized you. I didn't know the context at the time." I told him no apology was necessary on someone else's behalf. He considered this and then said, "For what it's worth, the speech was one of the best things I've seen at a wedding." I've been to a lot of weddings. I thanked him and meant it. He shook my hand again, differently this time, with both hands, and moved back toward the dance floor. Cillian Park appeared at my elbow approximately 30 seconds later with 2 glasses of something amber and said, "I've been best man 3 times, and I want to tell you, that was the best non-best man speech I have ever heard at a wedding." I accepted one of the glasses, which turned out to be whiskey, and clinked it against his. He said, "Your brother is going to be okay, you know. He just needs to figure out which version of your family he actually wants to be." I said I hoped that was true. He said, "It will be." He cried at his vows. Men who cry at their vows generally turn out okay. I thought about that for the rest of the evening. Soren and I left the reception at 11:15 p.m. We walked out through the hotel lobby and into the September night, which was cool and clear. The kind of autumn night that Ohio produces when it's reminding you of everything it can do before winter arrives and takes the credit. We stood on the sidewalk for a moment before deciding to walk rather than take a car, and we went through the short north without talking much, which is one of the things I love most about being with Soren. The ability to be in a significant moment without performing it. After about 4 blocks, she said, "How does it feel now that it's done?" I thought about it honestly. I said, "It feels like information. I said the true thing in a room full of people who needed to hear it, and now it's in the world, and it can't be taken back. And whatever happens next happens from a different starting point than before." She said, "That's a very measured answer for someone who just detonated a family dinner." I said, "Wow, it wasn't a detonation. It was a correction." She said, "The distinction matters to you." I said, "The distinction is everything." We walked another half block and she put her arm through mine and said, "For what it's worth, I've known who you were this whole time." And I believed her, which is its own kind of acquiring, not of a number on a document, of a truth that doesn't require an audience to be real. 3 months later, in December, Rowan called me. Not a text. A call, which between us was unusual enough to carry its own signal. He was calling, he said, because he and Petra had been talking, and they wanted to come to Cleveland and see what Arca looked like, or what it had looked like before the acquisition, what I'd built. I told him the office was mostly transitioned to Viridian Systems now, but I could walk him through it. He said that would be enough. We spent 4 hours together on a Saturday in December, walking through what had been the Arca offices, now partly repurposed, looking at old photographs from early days and client decks, and the original whiteboard from our first year that someone had photographed before we moved spaces. Rowan asked questions with the focused interest of someone who genuinely wanted to understand, not perform understanding. At the end of the afternoon, standing on the sidewalk outside the building in a December cold that was already trying to become winter, he said, "I'm sorry I didn't ask. For all those years." I said, "I know." He said, "I think I was afraid to see it. Because if you were doing something real and Dad was still treating you that way, that meant something about the family that I didn't want to look at." I said I understood that. I said it was also something he could choose differently going forward, which was the only direction available. He nodded. He said, "I talked to Dad." I waited. He said, "He doesn't know how to say he was wrong. I don't know if he ever will. But I told him I knew what he'd been doing, and that I wanted it to stop." He went quiet for a long time, and then said he'd think about it. That was the most Rowan had ever said to me about our father in 36 years of sharing him. I put my hand on my brother's shoulder. He let me. We stood there in the December cold for another minute and then went to get dinner, which is what people do when they've said the hard things and want to keep the door open without forcing it wider than it's ready to go. My father and I have not had the conversation yet. It may happen. It may not. What I know is that I said the true thing in a room of 210 people who were operating inside a false story. And the false story cannot be restored to its original shape. Things have been rearranged, some of them permanently. My mother called me on my birthday in November and talked for 40 minutes, which was the longest phone conversation we'd had in years. And at the end she said, "I should have protected you more when you were younger." I said, "Yeah, you should have." She cried a little. I let her. And then I said, "There's still time to do it differently." She said she knew. We're finding out whether she meant it. Arca's integration with Viridian is going well. Yeah, and I'm in an advisory role through the earn-out period and spending the rest of my time thinking about the next thing, which is a conversation I'm having with 3 people I trust and which is still in the whiteboard phase, which is my favorite phase. Soren and I moved in together in October, into a house in Ohio City with a porch and more rooms than 2 people need, and a kitchen that she has claimed entirely, and which I have ceded without negotiation, because her food is better than mine and some territorial disputes should be resolved immediately. She has a photograph on the refrigerator. It's from the wedding reception taken by one of Petra's friends, who sent it to us afterward without explanation. It shows me standing at the microphone in the Whitmore Grand Ballroom, not looking at notes. looking at the room, and the room looking back, to 210 people in a state of complete attention. I look in the photograph like a person who knows exactly where they are, which I did. For the first time in a very long time, I knew exactly where I was. And it turned out that the room my family thought they had me in and the room I was actually standing in had never been the same room at all. They just didn't know it yet. Now they do.